We've spoken anecdotally on the show about these instances of children being abused or not receiving medical treatment, specifically because of religious reasons. And today, to talk about this issue and more, is the author of the book Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment, Janet Heimlich. So, Janet, you say in the book that this problem is far more widespread than the few anecdotal cases I've talked about on my show. How widespread is this?
That's a great question. I wish there was some sort of tracking of these cases. It's only been done with narrow studies, and we really don't have a good handle on numbers. But what we often find out is there's a child that's been harmed after death, and then it makes the headlines, and we all are familiar with, say, a child who is medically neglected due to religious beliefs about faith healing. And so they die from things like diabetes or infections and things like that. Or we hear about a child that's beaten to death by a parent or a member of, or a neighbor or somebody like that who are part of a church that believes that the Bible says you should use the rod and use corporal punishment on children. Or we hear about these, pervasive problems of sexual abuse among clergy. So we're really just kind of trying to, track what's at the very top level, what rises to the surface and makes headlines in newspapers and online and so forth. What we have to appreciate is that for every child who we read about who has gone through horrific suffering, there has got to be an untold number of kids that are harmed but don't make headlines.
Right. I mean, because part of this is by its nature the type of thing that kids are not going to speak out about. So we can only imagine that for every one we hear about, who knows how many there are, hundreds, maybe thousands that we're not hearing about. So I kind of think that there are three areas here, and you tell me if you agree. There is number one. You alluded to the sexual abuse component, which on this program we particularly cover it vis-a-vis the Catholic Church, but certainly it exists across a number of religions. Then there's the physical abuse, which we've talked about, and there are actually some groups which maybe you can speak to, which have manuals and guides which actually dictate the physical punishment for children. And then number three is the medical neglect, which is choosing not to obtain medical services for a child, either through the idea that prayer will heal or through the idea that those treatments go against God's will. Now, of the three, which is the newest? In other words, some elements of these, I assume, have been around for a really long time. Which of these is seeing the biggest uprising lately?
Well, I want to first say that you're missing one huge area, which I think is the most pervasive, and that is psychological and emotional neglect and abuse. Oftentimes, we don't hear about those cases, even if religion is not involved, because they're next to impossible to prove.
Right, it's hard to quantify.
Absolutely. Although what you actually don't, in terms of finding that a child has been psychologically harmed, it actually is defined by the harm itself, the words that are used, for example, such as you're a sinner and you're going to hell, or that kind of thing. It actually is not defined by proven results, say, later on in life.
Interesting.
But I can almost guarantee you that whenever you have a case of religious child maltreatment that involves sexual abuse, physical abuse, or medical neglect, you will have psychological abuse or neglect as well.
Sure.
And
so back to the question of, is one of these something that we're seeing a particularly drastic rise in lately?
No, I wouldn't say that we are seeing changes in the rate of these things, only because we're not able to really track them. I mean, for example, when Child Protective Services comes in and interviews a family, they're not looking to see whether or not the motivation behind the abuse or neglect is religious or spiritual. When someone is pulled over to the side of the road by a police officer and they're given a ticket for speeding, that police officer will note whether or not it's alcohol related. But we don't have that same kind of tracking when it comes to child abuse cases.
No, although we did have a story last week where a woman got pulled over and actually said God was telling her to go 100 miles per hour, but that seems a little bit of an isolated case. Now, one thing people may notice when they read the book, and you address this in the introduction, is
that police officer doesn't have, like, they have a ready application with check boxes, and they have to know whether or not it's alcohol related or not. So I just wanted to, that's something I think we should do in terms of child protective services. But go ahead with your question.
Yeah, well, my question was going to be, I know that one of the criticisms will be that, hey, you're focusing on Christianity, which, of course, Bill O'Reilly said a few days ago is a philosophy and not a religion. But putting that aside for a second, that you focus on Christianity, you also talk about Judaism and Islam, but there's going to be this claim that, hey, are you focusing on Christianity because it's the worst offender, or are you personally just choosing to focus on that? Address that a little bit.
Sure. Without a doubt, the majority of cases that I talk about in my book happen to be Christian-based. That is simply because my book focuses on American crimes, and far more religious people in this country are Christian than any other faith. So that's simply the way the numbers fall out. If I were to do this same book, say in the Middle East, I'm sure you would have way more problems that are in Islamic communities, etc. What determines where you have more problems than not has nothing to do with what God people worship or what religious texts they're reading. It has to do with the authoritarian nature of the culture the child is being raised in.
So as such, I'm glad you used the term authoritarian, because we've been on the program talking for a while about traits that seem to be exhibited in parenting that leads to people growing up and being politically conservative, and traits in parenting that lead to children being liberal. And the number one trait that leads to conservative adults is when they are children, the parents have a more authoritarian parenting technique and tend to use more physical punishment. How do you think that ties in to the issues you talk about in the book?
It's an interesting question. There have been psychological studies done on individuals to determine what kind of a follower are they. Are they more of an authoritarian follower versus one who is more liberal? And these studies have shown that what are called authoritarian followers, meaning people who are very conservative in their beliefs, very conventional in their beliefs, who are pro-punishment in their beliefs, they tend to be more on the authoritarian scale, which means that they are much more likely to recognize an authority figure and follow that authority figure, as well as fight against those that they deem to be opposing that authority figure. And I do talk a little bit about those studies in my book, because what they have determined is that these very conservative, very pro-punishing people often are religious fundamentalists.
Interesting. Well, there's plenty more in the book that we haven't talked about. I encourage people to check it out. It is, of course, Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. We've been speaking with the author, Janet Heimlich. Thank you so much for talking to us today. I think this is, although it's a very sad topic to have to discuss, the book is fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, David.
All right, we'll take a break and we'll be back with plenty more after this. Stay tuned.